everybody for joining us. I'm Donna Lavoie. I'm President and CEO of Lavoie Health Science, which is a strategic communications firm advising health and science innovators with their communications needs. I'd like to start out by having each of our panelists introduce themselves. I'd like them to give their name, their title, just a little bit about their company, and also maybe just a couple of words about your current, where you are in your financing, how much you've raised to date, and sort of where you're at, maybe just to kick things off. So I'll turn it over to Greg to introduce himself.
Great. Thanks. So I'm Greg Stein. I'm the CEO and founder of Curtana Pharmaceuticals. We're a company based in Austin, Texas. We're focused on developing a small molecule therapeutic for the treatment of glioblastoma and other brain cancers. To date, I've raised about $12 million. 2/3 of that has been non-dilutive financing, and we're out doing a $12 million Series A to finance our early stage clinical development of CT-179.
Excellent. My name is Rick Berenson. I'm the CEO of Thermalin Diabetes. Thermalin is developing a portfolio of next generation insulin analogs. These are new chemical entity insulins that have superior performance capabilities to help lower the burden of insulin therapy for patients. We have raised to date $29 million. We are raising another 5 to 10 to close out what is a new Series A for us.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Muldoon. I'm with a company called Fast Biomedical out of Indianapolis, Indiana. We have a technology that measures intravascular volume, so the call points are major surgery, critical care, and sepsis. We've raised $30 million through a Series A2. We're wrapping up our third human trial right now. Our raises has been a combination of angels early. We've done non-dilutive funding with NIH, but mostly venture capital and single-family office.
Wow. Hi, I'm Joyce Lonergan. I'm CEO and co-founder of Mellitus. Mellitus is developing a new test for diabetes, starting with diabetes and pregnancy. To date, we've raised $6.2 million, mostly from private angels. And we're doing a Series B financing right now, raising $5 million. And this may be our first step out of the family and friends kind of private angel network into formal funds.
Great.
Yeah.
So as you can see, we have a great group of panelists with a lot of experience today. Before I get into some of the questions, I'd like just by show of hands to get a sense who's in the audience today. How many of you are either CEOs or members of managements and currently in a Series A financing? By show of hands, okay. How many Series B or later? Okay. Any seed financing in the room? Okay. Looks like we got a good healthy mix, which is great. So today we're going to cover three main topics. How to source investors, what does your investor universe make up of, where to focus, where not to focus, when do you cut bait? And then lastly, how do you go from your first meeting into a term sheet? So those are kind of the three areas that we're going to cover, I guess, in the next 45 minutes or so. And as we go through this process, I'll ask the panelists questions, but I'll also encourage any of you to raise your hands throughout and interject so we can have a good, healthy dialogue. So let's start with crafting your story and sourcing investors. Greg, what's been your experience in crafting your story, and how do you think about it from the standpoint of the key target investors that you're looking at in your current stage? And how has that maybe changed as you're evolving?
Sure. So a lot of this, I think, the messaging here is probably things people are familiar with, but it is, I've certainly found it to be true, is you certainly need to understand your audience. Is this a PhD VC, or is this a family office that may not be as sophisticated? So you certainly have to tailor the messaging to the audience. that you're going to be sitting down with at the moment. I'm always aware of what's my goal of that of that meeting. So, the first meeting has to be you have to stay very high level. I think there's a tendency to want to dive deep into the data really quickly, and I don't think that is I've not found that to be helpful. I've done that in the past, and it just you lose the forest for the trees. So certainly, being clear on what it is you're trying to accomplish and doing that in a timely fashion, so you don't lose people. So those are sort of I think for me the key things when thinking about crafting that initial messaging.
And do you go in with do you have kind of a standard deck that you're tailoring for each of the meetings, or how are you thinking about that?
So I have a deck for family offices, private individuals. I have a deck for institutional investors, and then I have a deck for partners. And that's sort of the way I tease it out, because each one has different things that I found different areas of focus.
Great. How about Joe? Joe, do you have anything to add to that in terms of from your experience? Is that pretty consistent with how you're thinking about it?
I'd agree with everything Greg said, but our approach has always been, be brief with the ability to go deep. I think the brevity is probably the most difficult part, right? Because we're all excited about what we're doing, and everybody's excited about the technology and the applications. And a big percentage of your target audience really just wants the first 3 minutes. And if you don't resonate in the first 3 minutes, move on and let them talk to somebody that they will resonate with. So I think we've really kind of focused on brevity with the ability to go deep, and we've really tried to avoid satisfying people's intellectual curiosity when it's just intellectual curiosity. It's really somebody that can't do a transaction with you. They've got no money left in their fund, or they're a strategic, but they'll never get involved until you're FDA approved. You can spend days answering their intellectually curious questions, and it's not a good use of your time.
How do you figure that out? If you're in the meeting, and how do you sort of tease out when they're just kicking the tires because they have another investment that they're looking at in a similar space, and they're using you for diligence? How do you sort of know that when you're in these meetings?
If I knew the answer to that question, I'd have less gray hair, but
If I knew the answer to that question, I'd have hair.
What's funny about being in this room and up on a panel is it can try and create the illusion that we know everything that we're doing. We've had some success and a lot of failure, and we're just figuring out, just like you. The times we've gotten it right, after there's initial interest, we really get busy doing homework on who we're talking to, who they invested with, what stages, what have they done, and you can generally develop a decent profile of people. It's a lot harder in the family office space because they're so stealth. You have to be pretty far down the road before you figure out whether they're for real or not. But institutional venture funds, strategic venture funds, definitely these angel groups, and even a lot of the angels, once you can tell there's some interest and some connection there, you go back and you do your homework.
I would add to that in that I'm very upfront in meetings, letting them start the conversation. Tell me about who you are, what it is you're looking for, and getting very specific. Where are you in the life cycle of your fund? How much dry powder do you have? Because if there's not a good fit, I want to know that up front. Or oftentimes they'll reveal to you, things that they're looking for, and you can focus your messaging then on those issues. So don't be afraid to be very assertive, because this is going to be a relationship, and like any relationship, both sides need to know who is on the other side of the table.
I would add a couple of things from our view. I think the goal of the first meeting is to get a second meeting, and you don't have to tell the whole story. So, I think keeping it brief is really critical. but, I just want to walk out knowing we're going to have a second chance. But we definitely do a huge amount of diligence up front on anyone we talk to. And by the time I've sat down with them, I've read their portfolio, I've read who they've invested with, try to see if we have any connections and commonalities to open the discussion. But I think in addition to what you guys have both said, we found that you have to check in a couple times during the process. Mandates change, funds change, stories within the fund and their world changes. And so you come in, you've done your diligence, you think you've got a group where you've got a good connection, but it's still worthwhile along the diligence process, checking back in again to find out, is this still in your mandate? Are we still on the right page? Because, the world changes and you don't want to get left behind.
So I think my panelists have helped us to understand how really random this process is. You go in, you try to figure out by asking lots of questions whether the investor's a potential fit. They could change their mind later. They could be spoofing you to get information. And the main conclusion to draw from that is that this is fundamentally a numbers game. You need to talk to a lot of people. As I say, there are a lot of frogs you need to kiss to get enough princes to fill out your board. And if you don't go in with that frame of mind, knowing that you have to do diligence that you go through, but you also have to turn through a lot of people because they're not going to reveal all the information you need up front. The best indicator I have for whether somebody is actually interested after a first meeting is whether they actually call you back or whether they actually initiate a call to you. And you want to find people who are going to do that. You want to hear the enthusiasm in their voice the second time you talk to them, because they're generally pretty good about making you feel good early on.
Great. So just to follow on to that, have you been in a situation where potential investor is asking for a CDA very early on, and has that given you pause? How do you think about sort of the ask for the CDA, if you will? And when do you get into that? When do you sign the CDA and move on to the next phase?
I would start with that and say, honestly, there's not a lot. We can tell our story very clearly without a CDA. If you need a CDA to understand the company, it just is a pause. I also find investors don't actually like CDAs generally because it requires maintaining confidentiality, and that creates a burden for both of us.
Right.
And, I like less paper. And CDAs require you to sit down and read it and, work through nitty-gritty stuff that you don't need to. But I also find that if an investor is asking you to get into a CDA, maybe that means they're serious and they want to get into deeper diligence. And certainly it helps you to understand what they're going to be like to deal with. If the CDA is a clean sale, it kind of gives you a sense of their interaction. If the CDA is a grind, take a message that maybe the interaction is going to be a grind. And so there's definitely a value to that interaction and that learning process. But I find we can tell you a lot about the company without a CDA. And so we don't need it from our view too early on until there's real diligence to be done, like IP diligence. That's our view.
Looks like Rick.
So I've actually never had an investor ask me to sign a CDA unless I have said I need a CDA.
Yeah.
Generally, particularly for early stage companies, if you have to go to CDA as part of your fundraising, you've got a problem. You've got to be able to tell your story in detail and be confident that your IP and your IP is strong and your ideas are very hard for others to replicate. That said, I'm now in the interesting turnaround situation where I have to get CDAs to be able to reveal some details on my current financing because I have a strategic involved. So, and at this point, I'm looking for people to say, yes, I will do a CDA quickly. But it's very different because of where we are.
Yeah, our experience has been similar. If you're dealing with a sophisticated investor, somebody that's invested somewhere near your space before, and if they haven't, stop talking to them because it's really hard to be the first one. They really don't want to sign CDAs early, and you don't want to either. We can tell you 99% of anything before telling you anything confidential, and you can understand the market and the technology and the application and whether you're interested in learning more. When they do ask for a CDA, it's a really good sign because now they're really spending time and they're really taking it serious. But we've rarely had investors ask us for one early. Probably the only exception is when they're more strategic, when it's a company that's strategic to you or a strategic venture fund. They sometimes want to share information with you about what's in their portfolio and how you could fit, and so they tend to come forward a little earlier with that idea.
Any comments or questions from the audience? Beth?
So I thought that was really interesting that the CDA can be a tell. The CDA is a grind, the relationship probably won't go well. Are there other tells earlier in the conversations that you have noticed along the way?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and this is going to sound maybe counterintuitive. So, tough's okay. Rude and condescending, not so much. And we turned down venture money early just because dealing with them was so painful. And we kind of had a gut check moment going, I bet they're probably not going to be better when they're on our board. I mean, they're just so painful right now. And I remember driving home that night going, I wonder if I just made the worst decision in my life because we needed capital. And we just finally said, we think working with you is going to be too difficult. Tough questions. This is real money. This is life and death stuff. Absolutely, you should be able to be put through the ringer. But there's a way to do that without being disrespectful and condescending, especially to your team when you bring your technical team in.
Can I just ask one follow-up? You said, did you actually say to them, we think working with you is going to be too difficult? Or did you soften that in some way?
We softened it. We just said, then they, we actually had a term sheet, and then they decided some more questions they wanted to ask, which is just, what? You gave me a term sheet and now you want more. And we just said, actually we just don't think this is a good fit. And so we're going to pass. And we could never go back to them again. I mean, they did not receive that message well. But fast forward to today, that was the right decision because the right investor was out there. We just hadn't found them yet.
But I'd add one thing. I think, and this is universal to all investors, I think I've started to feel like no fund or investment group treats us special. They treat everybody the same, just that everybody doesn't know that yet. And so if you have an interaction that's rough, they're not rough with you, they're rough with everybody, just the word isn't out there. And so, if funds are decent with you, then they're probably decent with everybody. So don't personalize the interaction. Take it from the big picture perspective, because it is like a marriage. And there are going to be board meetings that just don't go well. And if you can't lay it out there and say, look, this is what didn't work, and here's what we're going to do about it, and have a constructive discussion, then things aren't going to be good for anybody. Life's too short.
Other questions? Yes.
Greg, you mentioned that you have several decks for angels and VCs and family offices. Can you elaborate a little bit what is different?
What the difference is? So, for the family offices and the high net worth individuals and whatnot, they aren't in the habit of doing this type of investing. So I feel like I have to lay out for them, what do the comps look like on the exit side? So what do typical exits look like? What is the timeline going to look like? That sort of broader context information, which the VCs are very familiar with, right? So you don't have to put that in there. And then, with the partners, you certainly leave all the financials stuff out and focus really more on where do I see the advantage of partnering, and how can this relationship benefit both of our companies, which is information that the investors certainly aren't interested in.
Is there another question?
So I'll make comments about CDAs. So CDAs are frowned upon by VCs, as we already talked about. But you want to do that with corporate strategic investors. There is clearly a flow of information that will happen. They'll tell you very honestly, I have to get this reviewed internally with folks. And that could take a long time. So our approach has been to first have VCs interested and then go to the corporate VCs. They get much more interesting. I think you mentioned this about the pitch, but one of the issues I've faced is not preparing the team about what set of tough questions that can come in a very straight, direct way. A lot of scientists can't handle it. And so you have to prepare them for that event, that we're going to XYZ company, and you can face that. Just be
Yeah, and I think to that point, we debrief after every interaction, and I'm learning, my team's learning, and so we talk about how could we have answered that question better? Is there a way to shorten it up? Because we have such limited time, and I found the scientists really like to get into it, and so I've had to coach them and say, look, just answer the question, and answer it in less than an hour.
Very difficult. Great. Any other questions from me? Yes.
Were there any major mistakes that you made early on that you would warn other, new entrepreneurs of, or mistakes you thought you made, in Joe's case that actually ended up working out?
I've learned to become less confident about all the intricacies of the next steps. Early on, we were sure you were at step 1 and we knew exactly step 2 through 252 precisely. And we would talk about it confidently. And we were very wrong. I remember being in one, we were in Menlo Park presenting to a great fund, a big fund, and we had animal data. And I was explaining, quite confidently that, we're measuring physiology here. It's not a therapeutic. If we can measure it in a dog, certainly we can measure it in a human being. There's just not that much difference. And she literally started laughing. Like during my presentation, she laughed out loud, and I thought, well, that's kind of rude. And she was right. Then you're moving to your phase 1 and all these variables pop up, and we got through it. But I've learned to be a little bit less confident about all the details of the next steps and kind of keep it on, here's what we've done, here's what we've proven, here's what we endeavor to prove next, and be maybe a little bit less confident on exactly the next step.
I think for us, the mistake I would say, and you make these mistakes and you learn, right? That you think that going out and fundraising is by getting your target investor list and then going through this funnel, and we use the Resi database gruelingly, and it's awesome to work with, and we drill it over and over again, and we try to go through the target list. At the end of the day, it's about the lead. That's all it's about. It's about finding the lead. And that's my experience, is that your number 1 job and your number 2 job and your number 10 job is to find a lead investor, and everything else works out after that. And after you find your target lead, then you find your backup lead, because sometimes the target lead after a gazillion hours isn't the right fund, even if you've done all your checks. And it just happens, and it's part of life. So that's the mistake I think we've learned a lot about.
Great. So when you're going through these various meetings, how do you find the champion in that organization? And I know from working with some of our clients that sometimes your entry point is in particular in corporate venture capital and strategics. But it may be someone who's not the decision maker, somebody who's very, very smart, who has great technical background, who's really sort of kicking the tires on that. But how do you get to the right decision maker? How do you feel about sort of going in and having to sort of move up the channel, so to speak, to get to that decision maker?
All right, I'll take a crack. That's a great question, because that's so important. It is maybe the most important thing, and it's different whether it's an angel group. Like if before you present to an angel group, if you don't already have an angel that knows you, that loves your stuff, don't even present to them, because it's a waste of time, because you need that champion. Strategics, it's more challenging. How do you find them? Boy, I don't know. I think you just go back to keep your pipeline full at the top. We've had 2 different occasions where we were knocking on the side door of a strategic and nobody was answering, and nobody'd return our calls, and they weren't interested, and then the other door opens up and goes, I need to talk to you right away, where have you been? And just the ability for them to be in silos and not talk to each other was breathtaking. So I wish I had a more efficient path to finding that advocate, but you need that advocate, and I think you just have to make sure your pipeline is full for a chance to find them.
Yeah, I think with the larger VCs that have analysts and principals and layers, in the beginning I would get very excited by someone junior who was quite excited, but then quickly realized that they have absolutely no decision-making rights. and that they're just out scouting and they'll take this up the food chain, and that until you get that partner, say, on the line and they're interested, you're still not really in the door yet. You're just, just don't read too much into that initial enthusiasm that the analyst might have, because that is really no indication, I think, of what the senior folks ultimately are going to get excited about or not.
I think the process in VCs is much quicker than it is with strategics. If you can't get to a partner who's excited, you're simply not going to go anywhere. It's never going to make it through the investment committee, and so you got to move on. For strategics, my experience has been it's a long-term project. You meet with them, and then you meet with them again, and you meet with them again, and you try and meet with new people, and you build interest and engagement over time. And the person who ends up being your partner could be very surprising, but it's probably the person who attended most of the meetings. And so you're building relationships over time. That's how you convert somebody into being a champion, is that you connect with them over and over, you deliver progress, you answer their questions, you're engaged with them, and then eventually they start to carry the torch.
I guess I would add a couple of things. It's an investment. They're going to invest in us. We have to invest in them. And so we do invest heavily in those relationships. But for strategics, this is interesting, something that you guys have all said. We got an answer from one strategic, no, that's not our space, really not interested. And then 3 years later it was like, what? You do that? It's like, how is the same company? Companies change all the time. And so check back. If you feel that you're a good fit, check back a lot, because corporate missions change. This is strategically not in focus. Whoop, now it's back in focus. And if you just decide, so-and-so said no to me, we're not going to go back to them, you could get left out. And so it is worth rechecking, and finding new people and finding the same people. But it's also, we find, keeping the old people that you talk to in the loop when you're talking to the new people, because ultimately they do talk, and you don't want it to be like, oh, I felt like so-and-so did an end run around me. It's worthwhile copying people so that there's good cross-company dialogue, because again, you never know who's connected in companies.
They change back too, by the way, right? So you may be going along great thinking that they really like your stuff, and then suddenly there is either a political or a strategic or some other shift. This is also, and of course your champion could get reassigned, and so you can't really just get one champion. That's why a diverse set of relationships in an organization, it keeps the consonance in the organization in your favor, because if you've got one person who is dissonant, it can drag the whole organization away. So you have to have multiple champions, in my experience, to try and raise the overall positive feeling for you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any questions from the audience at this point, or comments? Yes.
You talked about keeping the pipeline full. What do you do when you've kind of gone through your Rolodex and you said, right, I've done it now? How do you refill it? What are the tips?
You go through LSN's Rolodex. So we did a couple of things. If you're looking for more substantive investors, LSN's database, I think, is unparalleled, and we've used it multiple times. If you're earlier stage and you're looking for angel investors, you need to find people who've got a passion for whatever it is you're trying to solve. Our approach was to go out and identify major donors to diabetes causes and to cold call into them. It was a big numbers game to get to people who'd be willing to talk to you without angering the donee organizations. But nonetheless, there are lots of people out there who care passionately about different diseases, and you have to go find them. And those people were definitely not in my Rolodex when I started.
To me, I tell my team, I said, if I'm in the office 3 days in a row, you should probably fire me because I'm not doing my job. You just have to be out in the world telling your story, not selling your story. I think that's what most people do wrong. I tell this potential investor my story, they don't seem interested, so I try and talk them into why they should be interested. Look, if you're not a fit, move on. It's a big world out there. Let them find the group that they are a fit with. Our best leads and our best investors came through these really indirect routes where we were just out there and we got invited to another thing and to another thing because we were doing some interesting stuff and we were talking about it in kind of a non-marketing way, and then a connection happened. Some of our best connections came when I was just trying to help somebody else, talking to another CEO about something, and then next thing I know, I'm being introduced to somebody else, and oh, they have an interest in this space. And so I think you have to just be out there is the main thing, and make lots of contacts. You'll be surprised where they go. Greg and I met 6 years ago, and we've talked and helped each other on a couple different things. You want to find like-minded people that are doing interesting stuff, and you want to talk honestly about your progress and what you know and what you don't know, and stay out there, and good things start happening. You start meeting them in very indirect ways sometimes, I've found.
Another thing I would say is that when somebody says, "I'm sorry, I'm not interested," it's okay to say, "Do you know anybody who is?" And the other thing that I think it's okay to say is, somebody makes an introduction to you, it's nice to say, you can call me if you need help on something too, because it is kind of a give and take. And I found that to be very helpful.
Yeah, and to answer your question about the Rolodex, you should be going way beyond whatever your initial universe is. So between Life Science Nation, Bio, that platform, I mean, there's enough platforms out there that finding people to talk to should not be an issue. It's finding the right fit, and that's where the numbers game comes in. Doing your diligence and probably weeding out more quickly the folks that just aren't a good fit. And getting a meeting is not a win. It's getting a meeting with somebody who you have a reasonable expectation that there might be a good fit, because you're doing both of yourselves a favor if you do that work up front, because there's lots of people who are looking for investment opportunities, but they might not have any interest in what you're doing.
And maybe one small note I might add to your point is that, you're in the meeting and you've got your 90,000 things that you want to get done during the week, and you're sitting across from somebody and they're just not interested. I think one thing to remember, and this is probably something everybody knows, but communicating like, "Darn, this is a waste of time," is not a good idea with your body language and your emotion. Communicating, "Hey, I'll see you again sometime. Let's stay connected," might be a better approach, because you're going to see that person in another organization, and they're not going to remember, Mellitus. They're going to remember you and your interaction with them. If it was crusty or it came across like, "Darn, this is a waste," they're going to take that home. So, the door is open at all times. Be welcoming, because there isn't really such a thing as a waste of time. You want to curtail your time, but again, emoting, "Darn, you're not going to be productive, I should move on, you're a waste of time." There's a way to say, "Hey, this isn't a good fit for us. Let's get on to something that benefits both of us. Hope I'll see you again." There's just a subtlety there, but people really remember you, and they remember how you interacted with them, and people have long memories. And so, I don't know, it's a small point, but.
No, I think it's a great point. So, yes, next question relates to, you've been at an important meeting. This is a meeting that you've been waiting for a long time. You've finally got it. You've prepped the team. You've got the deck is perfect. You got your best suit on, the whole thing. And you go in, fly to New York, and the meeting just doesn't go well. Have you experienced that? And if you have, tell us your story. What did you do? Did you say, "Okay, chalk it up to this wasn't the right fit"? Did you recover? Did you reach back and try to salvage it? Tell us your story, Joyce. You're nodding like, "Yes, I have one."
It's interesting, because I think your gut reaction, and I've been in that situation where you prepped and prepped and prepped, and you walk in and it's like, just like no connection. And I was with one of my colleagues, and they said at the end, like, "Why didn't that go right? How come they didn't," and it was like, it wasn't connected. It wasn't because of what you said or what you didn't say. And so don't recriminate. Number one, learn from it and find out what could have made the interaction go better. But starting to finger point and say, "Well, it was how you greeted them," or "That's a waste of time." Figuring out, was there anything that opened a door I don't like it because of your data. Great, if we have new data, we'll call them back. I really try to find some little wrinkle or opening, if it's really a high-value target, that we can keep that connection open and revisit it. But, always say thank you, always say we're hoping to see you again, and maybe reconnect in the future. And also find somebody who's a friend, who might know them, that maybe, if it's really your most perfect candidate, it's okay to, work the channels and find somebody who's on your side to say, hey, can you ring them up and give me any intelligence gathering? It's very good to get intelligence feedback. But, that last thing is obviously just dust yourself off and on to the next thing. Life is short.
Yeah, and I found in the early days, I was so committed to my script and telling the story the way I wanted to tell it. And each meeting, they come into it with a whole different set of experiences and expectations. And I've learned to be much more ad-lib. So the meetings that usually failed were because I was so committed to doing it my way and not listening and being aware of what their needs were and what their interests were. And if early on in the conversation I jumped to slide 20, then so be it. Who cares? I can come back, because this is really a conversation. And so I've become much more improvisational, I think, in presenting. And I think if you ask questions, if it feels like it's not going right, start asking questions and finding out why you're getting that sense. And go where they want to go, right? Because if you're resisting where they want to go, that's just going to tick them off to no end and not create a good rapport for an ongoing relationship.
I think that small companies often suffer from what I call rut syndrome. It's you against the world. You start developing a perspective on what your story is and on what other people think, and you all reinforce each other. And so if you prep and prep and prep and prep, you're probably reinforcing the rut, and you're going to be stuck not doing what Greg said you really need to do, which is you got to know your stuff, but you ought to know your stuff anyway. And so if you're going to prep, understand who the parties are. Don't try and perfect your pitch. Understand who you're going to go and talk to. The meetings that I've gone to that haven't gone well, I've kind of known that there was a big risk because I had no idea who I was talking to. There's an expression that says, if you don't know the outcome, don't hold the meeting. So if you don't know who you're pitching to, there's a good chance it's not going to work out. And if that's the case, my view is, okay, numbers game, move on.
I really agree with what Greg said. The best meetings for us are where they become conversations. When they're presentations, they don't go as well. Our best meetings, we never got past the third slide. We started fielding questions and what about and and you never got past the third slide, which was great. So if it goes poorly, what do? It depends on why it went poorly. If it went poorly because their version of the macro world is just different than our version of the macro world, so they're like, you know what, nobody's ever going to need this ever, move on. Wrap up the meeting and move on, and they might be right, or maybe you're right, but you're not going to convince them today that you're right. If it's that, they misperceived something in your story, or they didn't think your clinical data was compelling enough, or you're not far enough along, then spend more time asking questions so you can figure out, can I navigate my way to the answer that they want that I didn't give them, or get to an inflection point that I'm not at yet, and then I know when to come back, and then you've got another shot. But if it's because their view of your role in the world is just different than your view, I think you move on and let somebody else present to them that might be a fit.
Any other comments or questions from the audience? Okay, so the next question is, what do you do when you think the meeting went pretty well? You're hoping that it might go to the next stage, but it seems like consistently all you hear is, come back when you have the data. When you have the data, then we'll take a closer look. Have you been in that? I presume that you've all been in those shoes before. What do you do?
Well, that's a screen. If they need data you don't have, you've got to come back to them when you have the data. As a general rule, if they're looking for something you don't have, they're simply not going to invest. It tells you they're a later stage investor. And if you're earlier than the data they need, then find somebody who isn't.
What I've found most frustrating in those situations is you do come back with the data, and then, we want this data. More data. And it can kind of drag out. And for me, that's a tell that, there may be some marginal interest, but at the end of the day, it's like, well, we've come to you a couple times with data, and we're not progressing, so maybe it's time for us to just move on.
Well, I think that it's also really useful to find out when they say, show me the data, what data do they want to be shown? Do you need clinical data? That often is that's typically what they're actually looking for. Show me the clinical data. Do you need large animal proof of concept? What is it you need? Because you don't want to come back too early. But if they're misleading you, if they say, yeah, bring us some clinical data, if they're not being specific, I get that's a tell for me.
And maybe just one little follow-up note is that, we'll often ask, what is it going to take to get you to yes? And it's okay to ask that early in the discussion because, we have, funds have investment criteria, we have investor criteria, and again, if you're not a match, there's a lot of work to finding an investor.
One of the things I did early on, so we're in the brain cancer space, and one of my big questions early on was, does anybody care about brain cancer? It's a really tough, high unmet medical need. Once we get to the finish line of, assuming we're making progress, is there even going to be a partner out there for us? So one of the things I did early on was bring in a BD person, and we went out and talked to all the strategics way before we were in a position to be of interest to them, but to really do it as from an intelligence gathering perspective, to really understand what's the data package going to need to look like, because they're ultimately, they're really your customer. And so it gave us some great insight into what the scope of the data package needed to look like and where they might find interest. And that then helped us when we were talking to VCs, because we had a much better sense of ultimately what that exit's going to look like, because that's what they're thinking about even at the early meetings.
So what you're talking about is the notorious scope creep, which happens all the time. And I think the way you manage against that is that you really do your homework well before you get those investments. And then, once you have a lead on your round, which is really, really hard to get, but once you have a lead and it's priced and you're doing it, you just make it clear that, no, we're not starting the next trial while we're raising this round, that we're gonna fill out this round and then we're gonna do the next steps. And it kind of flushes out the people that want a little bit more, want a little bit more, want a little bit more, and kind of brings the people in the tent that are going to make a yes/no decision on where you are right now.
So going back to the interaction of the meetings with the various investors and bringing in your team, I guess I would ask is different folks coming from different disciplines have different point of views, and they may not always be used to interacting with these type of investors and things. What have you done to coach those folks on your team? And what do you do if you have a really smart scientist or clinician or any discipline on the team, and they're great at what they do, but they're just not the person to be the front person with the
Leave them back in the office.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I've got one of my team members is brilliant, but he cannot communicate, and I've tried to coach him, and it's not the right fit, and so you just have to find other ways to communicate that data.
And how did that person take that? Did they feel?
I think they understand what their strengths are and where they're not strong, and it hasn't seemed to have affected our ability to function or operate.
Great.
I'd agree if they can't do it up front, just leave them in the office. By the time we're bringing in our technical team, we're pretty far down the road with somebody, and we're blessed with a great technical team. And I just try and coach them a little bit, saying, look, you're gonna present to a lot of people that are more like my IQ level as opposed to your IQ level. So I might interrupt you at times, and I'm not trying to be rude. I just know that you're giving them way more than they need, and their eyes are going to start rolling back in their head. And so I just kind of coach them. I'm not trying to be rude to you. I'm gonna stop. I've got to make the call when they've got their their question answered, and it's time to move on.
Any other thoughts? Or?
No, it's baseball season and Patriots season, right? So, you're the coach, you got to get the right team. And everybody isn't the right team for every meeting. And an investor doesn't necessarily need to meet the last human being in your company in the first set of meetings. There'll be a point in time when everyone needs to meet, but it's not maybe early on. And use your team's time wisely. So we try to keep it very, very focused and titrated. There's a lot of information to absorb, and then you have to absorb people. That's a lot for an investor to take on. You're trying to get to yes. It doesn't mean doing a roster review. It means get to yes on your data and your investment proposition.
Any last parting questions, comments from the audience?
So maybe I'll ask, how do you put pressure to get things done fast? You're interested, but things just languish. People use all kinds of wrong techniques of saying, I got another term sheet, which is usually bad if you don't have a real term sheet. But what are the other ways that you felt, do you go around your circle, use your circle to help put some feelers out there saying things are moving fast, or new tricks that you learned? I know old tricks.
Well, I think you need to be respectful, and yeah, that gamesmanship can come back to bite you in the rear. So you certainly need to be careful about what you're putting out there, because if you don't deliver on that, then you lose credibility. My approach is just gentle pressure, trying to understand that they're seeing lots and lots and lots of deal flow, and it's not that they're not interested oftentimes, it's just that they have a lot of other things on their mind, and so it's a bit of a marketing thing where it's just, you're looking for that mind share. So just a general, I don't know, just a email every couple of weeks. What are you thinking? Do you have more questions? And if people are interested, they follow up. Oftentimes they'll, hey, thanks for reaching out. I just was too busy. But try not to bludgeon them, because that's clearly ineffective in any relationship.
Thank you.
The only one I've seen work is competitive pressure, that you're going to fill out the round without them, which is really hard to create. And I don't believe in bluffing it, just because that always comes back to bite you. So it's always been really hard to get the lead, but then once we get the lead, it's tougher, but not as hard to get 50% of the round filled out. And then once you get to 51%, you're oversubscribed, because now people are like, oh, if I don't make a decision and this is a good deal, I'll lose the deal. And then, then they kind of rush. But that's the only thing I've seen work, is you've got to create competitive pressure where, like, I'm going to lose this deal if I don't take it.
Yeah, I think that pressure, it's a relationship, and I think to everybody's comment, it's better to be straight up with people. You can't create, the pressure if it doesn't exist, but there's a point in the process where you're kind of done. And it's okay to say, we've had a really good process, and we've provided you with what you need, and you only have 24 hours in the day. They just don't exist more than that. So there's just a natural, the process winds down at some point, and it's okay to say, this has worked really well, we've covered what we need to, and want to figure out what it's going to take to get your decision made. And the other thing is, there's the gift of your board. I have to report back to my board on this, and I'm going to have to give them an answer. Gosh, I'd be so sad if it wouldn't be yes. But if the answer is not yes, let us know. Honestly, it's way better to get the real answer. You try not to create the opportunity for someone to say no, but there is a point in the process where you're kind of done. And people hate to say no. And so if that's what they really mean, and it's just taking longer for them to have the guts to say it, really, it's better to get an answer than to string along forever.
So it looks like our time is out, but very quickly, parting words, if anyone has them.
Fundraising is something you do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, forever, until you make a huge amount of money and you're earning and you have product sales. So when everybody asks me, are you fundraising? Yes, every day.
We're always fundraising, and we're always recruiting, even when we don't have an open round and even when we don't have an open position, because those are the two most critical things to your success. it's a sales process, and a lot of people that do it aren't familiar with sales processes, so get familiar with one.
Amen.
Great, thanks everyone for coming, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.